Hey everyone, Happy New Year to all of you. In 2019, we of course continue our narrative series with another Star Wars vs. Earth episode being the first of the year. I would like to inform you guys that a recent update of the War of the Worlds mod made to where the coloring and name of the invading faction retracted to its normal self. Weirdly enough, its leader is still listed as Palpatine, and even though I tried to redo what I did before to change the name to Galactic Empire, it would not change. That is why halfway through this episode, and probably from now on onward, the color of the invading nation will be red, and the name will say that they are Martians. I will try to hide the name, and in the story, they will still be the Galactic Invaders. With that being said though, please enjoy the rest of the video. It was the beginning of the 50s. The time that would be known as the drought would soon be upon the world. Battles were still raging on through Turkey for a second time. And as blood was spilled on their soil, Norway got to endure the wrath of Stalin. With the Soviet Union having forced its will upon so many nations, it became pretty much unstoppable. Weapons and armor had changed through the years. The nations that belonged to the Comintern were using the latest weapons known as the AK-47, the Kalashnikov, a weapon that would go down in history as the most reliable of all. For tanks, they relied on the newly created T-54, powerful enough to steamroll over any of Earth's nations. But if they would hold out against Palpatine's armies, would be a different story. Though Turkey was initially losing its battle with the stormtroopers, it was not the first time that they were able to come back from a similar position. Intel suggested that Palpatine's invasion force for Earth was almost at its limits. He surely possessed more fleets for backup, but his manpower around Earth itself seemed fleeting. Now this still meant that he had millions of troops stationed on Earth that would not go down without a fight. In Africa, another attempt was done by the armies of Earth of secluding the reinforcement and supply line around the Suez. Though it was expected that the Imperial stormtroopers might still get it back, it did require effort and manpower on their part, meaning they were slowly dying by 1,000 cuts. With Stalin setting his sights currently on Asia as well, it would not be too long before they would descend down all the way towards Australia. The armies were being assembled across the coastal line, but everyone knew that they could not win from this behemoth. The Comintern controlled almost every nation left on Earth, and Australia did not have the manpower nor the resources to deal with an attack on that scale. The Soviet Union seemed much more capable of dealing with the supply lines of Palpatine. They spread out quick, towards both the Middle East and Africa. Because of this, the similar scenario repeated itself once more where the Turks pushed back the Imperial stormtroopers. Norway continued to be broken down by Stalin's armies. It was clear that capitulation would soon occur. Sweden, funnily enough, did not have to endure any similar travesties. By now, the battle and war itself had almost completely turned into the Comintern versus the Galactic Invaders. According to Intel, Palpatine had less than 3 million men stationed on Earth, of which most resided in the Americas. At the end of June, a counter-offensive by the stormtroopers proved successful in pushing the Soviets back, but not eradicating them completely. 2 days later, Norway officially had fallen into the hands of the Soviets. The armies here would immediately be sent over to Africa, as another offensive was planned along the entire coast to descend down towards South Africa and take the whole continent back. Though Palpatine had succeeded into completely breaking up the forces around the Suez, his left guard was open, meaning that Comintern armies that arrived from Europe ascended the beaches to claim territory with relative ease, as there were not that many stormtroopers in Africa to begin with. Then in July, the news arrived that the British Raj also had capitulated and would be reinstated with the Soviet government like all nations before it. With India under Soviet control, their strength rose incredibly. Palpatine ordered his armies to move westward in North Africa, but it was already too late. His men were now being pushed back on both sides, ultimately leading up to a pincer attack that he could not possibly win with the amount of units he had here. By 1952, the upper half of northern Africa had pretty much been retaken by the armies of Earth. The galactic units to the east were on their own. All that was left was Saudi Arabia, that was now being invaded from two angles by several Comintern armies. The rest of Stalin's forces headed down south to retake Africa. Palpatine would not send in new reinforcements. Stalin's wrath could now also be felt all the way in the Dutch East Indies, meaning they were on Australia's doorstep. With the way the war was going now, it would seem that retaking Saudi Arabia would still take several months and maybe even years, as most of the galactic forces still resided here. But the rest of Africa had only spread out armies that were of a modest size. By this time, jet fighters had come into play with the Earth and Air Force. They were now able to do bombing runs more quickly, and at the same time be more effective at air support during large sieges. By July of 1952, the news came out that Australia and the Soviet Union had agreed on terms to make a peace deal, but it was not as black and white as it all seemed. Though the Soviets did agree to sign peace, they demanded several heads chosen by themselves to be assigned in the Australian office. Many could already see what this would mean in the long run. It seemed that by doing this, the Soviets would not have to waste any blood and manpower on conquering another nation of Earth, but instead, they would destroy it from the inside out. Those assigned by the Soviets would be financially backed by them as well, and would in due time stir up the hornet's nest to acclaim support for communism in the continent. With almost all earthly nations in the hands of Stalin, the long-awaited all-out assault on Africa was underway, and Stalin absolutely dominated. Taking notes from his former German comrade, he unleashed absolute hell on Palpatine's units stationed here. It became clear that no matter who would win in this conflict, that Earth, in the end, would be ruled by a tyrant. Even if the armies of Earth would win, Earth itself would still lose. Palpatine's coming had unleashed the apocalypse. Parts of Africa that had been conquered were temporarily handed over to other puppet governments, as Stalin wanted but one thing: to have Africa in his hands. If Africa would be retaken, which is definitely pointed out towards that result, the next challenge for his armies would be to invade the Americas, a job easier said than done. With so many countries now combined under a red fist, the strength and manpower at its disposal surpassed 20 million soldiers. Palpatine had none of that, but he held the ground of the Americas, and over the past years, he built to keep those coastlines fortified. The Emperor had abandoned his troops in Saudi Arabia, who still fought valiantly. They continued the battle months after being cut off, some disillusioned on the note that Palpatine would send in reinforcements. By now, Africa had been divided in two parts remaining to the galactic invaders. To the west, a large chunk was broken, and the stormtroopers were defenseless. Unlike the soldiers battling in Saudi Arabia, many of the units surrendered and turned as rebels to fight alongside the humans of Earth. It might have been a lack of leadership that led to this, as multiple high-stature officers were still fighting in Saudi Arabia, feeding morale to the troops. But despite hopes of victory, they were being pushed back towards the coast with each passing week. At the end of 1952, pretty much all of Africa had been reconquered. More territory was divided up and given to several governments. As the last of the remaining Imperials were being dealt with, plans for invasions of the Americas were already underway. In the beginning of 1953, the war within Saudi Arabia was still going on. The humans of Earth had no way of losing this, but the remaining Imperial stormtroopers were some of Palpatine's best. They had learned to adapt and fight on Earth, and the sandy terrain made it easy for them to claim casualties in the name of the Empire. But with so much time having passed, many here too seemed somber about expecting to come out of this alive. Morale was low. The Soviet Union pushed Australia to initialize a naval assault at the most southern point of South America. At the same time, Comintern invasions would occur on other parts of the coast further north. Preparations would take a little over 2 months. Those 2 months should be enough for some generals to take back most of Saudi Arabia. It had now dwindled on for so long that even some stormtroopers of Palpatine's most elite units surrendered and turned sides, mostly because of their long fighting without any sign of reinforcing. Stalin had so many nations under his thumb that he felt confident in claiming victory. But some of his staff were not so sure that they would be able to take back America, maybe even within a span of 10 or 20 years. Aerial photos showed that within South America, most activity on Palpatine was along the center and north, including its coastlines. The southern point was completely exposed. Some believe this may have been done on purpose to lure an invasion and quickly send in a response force to deal with it swiftly. Halfway through the preparations, there were still no signs of any galactic activity on the southern point where the Australians would invade. The parts of Saudi Arabia that now were still in the hands by the stormtroopers were completely split up. Many had realized for a long time that there was no way they could win this. Communist Japan had even invaded their old homeland to take it back in their name and erect a communist government to rule the ancient land by Stalin law. And then at the end of March, green light was given for the invasion to commence. More than 30,000 Australians headed into the boats that would lead them to shore, to bloodshed and destruction.